The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
I'm John Horgan, and it's Thursday night. Popcorn? Check. Cold beverage? Check. Comfortable chair? Check. Voice of BC? I'm ready to go.
My goodness, he's in a good mood these days. Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, last show of the fall season, and delighted to have on the panel two of my very good colleagues from the Press Gallery, Mike Smyth of the Province. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Vaughn.
And Rob Shaw from the Sun. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Vaughn.
And we're going to start off, we'll tell people we're pre-taping this show on Tuesday night for a reason, because we're going to talk about Site C. And this week, the government is meeting behind closed doors, as they say, to discuss the fate of Site C. They had a caucus meeting today, Tuesday. They have a cabinet meeting tomorrow, and they may have a decision by the end of the week. So by the time you're watching this show, they might have already decided. But we're members of the Press Gallery, and we try to lead the way. So we're going to predict what we think they're going to do. Mr. Smyth, what are they going to do?
Well, I've already gone out on a limb and predicted they're going to continue to build the dam because I just think that the downsides on it are too much for the government to bear. I mean, if you take a look at the cost of the thing, they've already spent $2 billion on the dam. And it would cost another $2 billion in remediation costs, as they call it, to basically clean up everything they've done up there. That's $4 billion for nothing, basically a big scar on the land up by the Peace River there. I don't think the government really likes that idea. I think the optics of John Horgan firing over 2,000 construction workers a few weeks before Christmas is not very appealing. I think they're worried about a $4 billion write-down having an impact on hydro rates, being forcing them to raise electricity rates. And also I think they're worried about a potential downgrade on the province's credit rating if they decide to take a $4 billion write-down for nothing. So for all those reasons, and also I think another big one is pressure from the big trade unions to continue building the dam with a new project labor agreement that would require more union workers on the site, more apprenticeships and that kind of thing. And this is a government that's very close to those unions. So for all those reasons, that's what I think they're going to do. I think they're going to continue building it.
I've been leaning that way for a while. I will say that in the last week or so, there's been a heck of a lot of pressure on the government, including from a lot of people who identify themselves as NDP supporters, trying to talk them out of it and saying that it isn't as bad as it has been made out to cancel. What do you think, Mr. Shaw?
It's the damned if you do, damned if you don't file for the NDP. It's a difficult one. I think a lot of people looked at the experts that were called in to brief John Horgan's cabinet and the decidedly negative opinions they have about Site C and started to wonder if, the Premier's ear and the Cabinet's ear was being bent by one particular side of this argument to abandon ship and leave it alone. There were other arguments raised this week. There was a press conference with Harry Swain, the former chair of the Joint Review Panel from 2014, two First Nations up there, Prophet River and West Moberly. They were raising the argument that you don't need to pay $1.8 billion to remediate the land. Just basically up tools, take them away, let Mother Nature do the work to remediate it, save yourself some money. There's an argument out there whereas maybe you don't need to repay all of that money in the 10-year amortization period that Hydro assumes is going to lead to the 10% jump in your hydro rate. So if you were to do that, maybe find a creative way to put some of the debt back onto the province's books just enough not to imperil the credit rating, spread out the payments enough not to have a rate shock. Maybe you could make the case to pull the plug on it. I actually agree with both of you that probably they'll continue it. I think they'll continue it with a overhaul of the BC Utilities Commission, a package deal to say, look, we don't really want to do this. It's too far gone, but we're going to make sure another Site C never happens again, and that's why we're changing the regulator. We're putting in strengths. We're going to maybe change BC Hydro so that they don't go off course this way again, and package it that way to kind of placate some very angry, there will be very angry NDP supporters who don't want this thing. They thought they voted for a party that was going to kill it because, as you both know, the NDP were very careful in their language in the election to kind of insinuate that, vote for us and we will get rid of the dam. Several cabinet ministers made that argument with enough ambiguity that people believed that's what the NDP were going to do. And so some voters will feel betrayed, but I'll also add it's early enough in the NDP's mandate that if they make an unpopular decision, they can find a way to resell it, repackage it, hope people forget about it 3 years from now, perhaps, when we have the next election.
I thought it was interesting, too, that Andrew Weaver of the Green Party took them off the hook, said that he thought the NDP would approve the project. He's backed away from that a little bit this week, but he still said he thought they would go ahead, and he said he wouldn't bring the government down over this issue. The Greens would not defeat the government in the House on this issue. And this week, he told a bunch of us in his office that the reason he wouldn't do that is because he doesn't think if he forced an election, the Greens could win the election. He thinks it's far more likely that the Liberals or the NDP would win a majority and that Site C would continue. So I'm with the both of you. I think they will go ahead. I think in addition to the changes that Mike and Rob talked about, I think they will repackage this as a project to electrify British Columbia, and I don't mean in the sense of thrills, but in the sense of getting the oil and gas industry to use more electricity, perhaps sell some of the electricity to other provinces, to build a future using electric cars. I think they will repackage it, not just do it as is. In any event, as I say, by the time you're seeing this show on Thursday night, it may have already happened. It may happen Friday. I think it will happen very soon. The Premier's going away soon. He's doing his wrap-up interviews next week. So the decision is at hand. I wanted to, before we go to questions on tape, gentlemen, just ask you about a couple of other things that happened this week. We saw David Eby, the Attorney General, start to take action on a running scandal over money laundering in BC casinos. And if you've been following the work of a very good reporter, Sam Cooper of Post Media, he's reported a lot on this. And we've had the first actions, Rob.
Yeah, the Attorney General had hired an outside expert in this field to produce a report. It is not done yet, but he also told the individual to come forward with any interim recommendations if they need to be done immediately. And two have come forward. One is identifying the source of money that's more than $10,000 that is taken to a casino to gamble with. That has to be identified, the bank that it came from or the source that it came from. And if you have more than several large transactions like that, then there's additional investigation into where the money is actually coming from. And then also to have enforcement staff available 24/7 for casinos to draw upon, to ask questions. Kind of makes you wonder why that wasn't already the way that the system was set up. Makes perfect sense, but as Sam has outlined in his stories, there is just a total absence of checks and balances on where this money is coming from.
The attorney said that when he talked to us that he has been continually surprised. He knew there was a problem, but he's been continually surprised at the details of what's going on, like the famous duffel bag full of $20 bills, and the fact that there was nobody keeping an eye on these places for most of the day. It really is something.
Well, if you were a clever money launderer, maybe you could figure out when the staff was on and say, hey, maybe I'll take my hockey bag full of 20s from drug deals and go to the casino maybe at 3 a.m. When the staff's not around and do my transactions then. So yeah, it is pretty astonishing. It's a good example of how work by a really good reporter, Sam Cooper, as you mentioned. I'll give him a shout out too. Yeah. For people who've not read his stuff, I encourage people to go online and read it at the VancouverSun.com or theprovince.com where the stuff is posted, because he's done a tremendous digging on it, and it's triggered the government's reaction. It's interesting though that you remember the movie Casablanca, where the French police chief is shocked that there's gambling going on at Rick's Cafe. At the same time, the croupier is handing him his winnings.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of that a little bit, because here we have this report saying, oh my goodness, we're shocked that this is going on in casinos. This has been raised for years. And I remember 5-6 years ago, there were a lot of stories about, wow, is there a lot of money laundering going on in BC casinos? And the then Liberal government had promised action and that kind of thing. There is so much profit flowing, though, into the coffers of government and these casino companies. Was there a blind eye turned to this stuff going on for years? This is just an interim report that came out this week. There'll be another report that could shed more light on what previous governments knew or what previous officials knew about this stuff, and did they do enough to stop it?
Eby said that one of the things he wants to find out is not just where the money was coming from, but once it had been washed through the casino, where was it going?
Yeah.
Was it being used to buy businesses or real estate in BC?
That's the other reason the New Democrats actually like this file quite a bit. Not only are they cleaning up the casino mess, but there have been suggestions in Sam's stories and others that the laundered money from underground Chinese banks or what have you is then used to make real estate purchases in Metro Vancouver, infuriating all of the voters who were infuriated by that subject in the election, many of whom voted New Democrat. So there's a double whammy for the NDP to crack down on this. They can also point to the housing file and say, look, unscrupulous foreigners with shady money are also being driven out of the real estate sector.
And pointing a finger at the Liberals while they do it, right?
Yeah. One of the things, too, Eby said was that when he got his first briefing on this, we always wanted to be world-class here in British Columbia. This model was so effective, so obvious, and so easy to get the money through the system that it was known as the Vancouver model for money laundering. That's how famous we were all over the globe. So that's not a proud moment in our provincial history, and I agree with what you just said, Mike. I think a lot of the blame goes to the previous BC Liberal government for not doing enough. I don't blame the New Democrats for making hay on this one. I think it's justified. We also had action this week on what is likely to be, we're told, one of the busiest files for government next year, namely getting ready for legalization of marijuana. It's not something the New Democrats asked for. It's something the federal Liberals imposed on them. But they're getting ready, so we heard a little bit of action on that from Solicitor General Mike Farnworth this week.
Yeah, a couple of the big announcements he made was the age for people to buy legal marijuana when it's available next year will be 19 in BC, and he also announced that there would be a distribution model in the province that would be handled by the BC Liquor Distribution Branch. Now, this is something that is good news for a couple of key parties that are interested in selling legal marijuana in the province, and that includes the government liquor stores, and particularly the union that represents the government liquor stores, and also private liquor stores. These are two sides that are normally kind of enemies. They would fight with each other over the liquor business in BC, but they've made an interesting kind of team up on this one. The private liquor stores and the government for the government and the union for the government liquor stores coming together and saying, let us sell marijuana in BC when it becomes legal. We already have staff that are fully trained in selling a controlled product to an age-restricted customer. We have a fully developed distribution system. We have excellent stores that we can sell the product in. Let us do it. Now, as we all know, in Vancouver and also in Victoria and some other places, there's lots of marijuana stores that are up and running right now. They are dead set against that because they have a feeling that, especially people who have been in the sort of the anti-prohibition movement, have been fighting for legal marijuana for decades, saying, we've finally won, we finally have legal marijuana, and now here comes government and these big liquor stores swooping in to take this away from us. We want to be able to sell this product too. So this is a real puzzle for the government of what they're going to allow. It sounds like they're going to allow sales in government liquor stores and private liquor stores, but will other retailers get an opportunity to sell it too? That remains to be seen so far.
Yeah, the other thing that struck me, Rob, is that Farnworth was on this show a little while ago, and he expressed concern that British Columbia producers of the famous BC Bud would have trouble getting licenses and access, because the feds issue that, to sell their product in British Columbia. And if they couldn't sell it through the stores here, through the distribution here, they might remain in business, and you might have a problem with that. So I would think if the government's taking control of distribution through the liquor stores, they're probably going to be able to ensure at least some of the BC producers have their conduit to the BC stores.
Yeah, the equivalent of the craft brewing industry, the craft marijuana industry. That's been a talking point of the Greens as well, that they want to ensure that the local producers are still in the game, so the NDP have to cater to that. Licensing, though, is handled by the feds, and Farnworth was asked today about that, and he said, we're not going to develop a BC licensing system, clearly federal responsibility, we can only do what we can do. So they might have limited influence there, but and then the other question is the money. I mean, there's no real settlement yet from the feds on exactly how much. There's movement on the 50-50 revenue sharing from Ottawa. It looks like the provinces might get some more on that. That's some of the stories from Ottawa in the last couple of weeks. And where's that money go? Public education, how much do the cities get for policing and the costs that they have to bear? So there's a lot of really big details being ironed out on this one.
And we've said it on the show before, but I will repeat it, that Mike Farnworth, the minister in charge, is also warning that this is going to take up so much time next year. drafting and passing and amending maybe 12.5 pieces of legislation regarding the Motor Vehicles Act and police and landlord and tenant and strata title, because will you be allowed to smoke marijuana in your strata? All these things. We are going to be busy dealing with this next year, getting ready for Cannabis Day, as we joke. Don't say that to a federal Liberal. They're kind of sensitive about the idea that Canada Day will be renamed Cannabis Day next year. I don't think legalization will actually take effect on July 1st. We've got a lot of questions on tape for our panel here, and we're going to start off with one about the tone in the British Columbia Legislature. It was just adjourned last week. We had a busy fall session and a fairly raucous one. Here's Jamie Lawson from the University of Victoria.
I'm hearing rumblings, not having watched too carefully myself, that the tone in the legislature of late has been really abysmal. And I'm thinking particularly here about this peculiar debate about whether the opposition can deliberately misname ministers and their titles. Has the tone really descended to historic lows in the legislature, or is this just standard fare for a BC legislature?
Well, I will say that if you watch the Hansard Channel on television, as I think most people see the Ledge that way, some of the noise and chaos and heckling and raucousness is muted because the microphones are on the member speaking, or you hear the speaker tell them to behave themselves. But in the chamber, it's wild.
Yeah, it does get pretty wild. It does get pretty nasty at times in there. Sometimes it's interesting to look up at the visitors gallery and you will see these little kids who were there on a school trip, all wide-eyed, looking at these adults kind of yelling and screaming at each other. And I know for a fact there's one of the security guards at the legislature over here has kind of a standing joke when he tells these kids, he goes, "All right, kids, when you get back to class, make sure you do not behave like what you just saw in here." So, yeah, I mean, but it's ever thus though. I mean, hasn't it always been kind of? It seems a little nastier right now, but I've seen it pretty wild in there for
this
years.
Early in the life of a government. This nasty, I would say, is unusual. Usually, it takes a couple of years to build up this much of a head of steam.
But like to me, I've been thinking about this a bit. I ranted on Twitter about it because what is Twitter for if not to rant? But I think we have to have a serious discussion about. A lot of people say question period is it's not called answer period, it's question period because there's no answers. Heckling is used as a tool to combat spin and deflection in the House. And if you have watched the New Democrats perform in this session, there are many ministers who do not answer very simple questions, who spin and deflect. And I don't think we want a legislature where everyone is forced to sit in absolute silence and listen to Claire Trevena, and I'm using her in particular because she's been egregious on this, spin and not answer very simple questions about her file. I don't think that's the point of debate in the House. So we need to have look, if we're not going to answer questions, if it's theater, then fine. I think heckling has a place. If the government of the NDP wants to rise to the occasion here and answer the questions, then great. I think that the Liberals wouldn't have a leg to stand on.
And on that note, we will take a brief break on Voice of BC and be right back. I might even say a few words about the new speaker. Stay with us.
The BC Liberal leadership race has come down very hard against a referendum on proportional representation. They claim that it's undemocratic, which of course seems very absurd. It demonstrates how very out of touch they are with public opinion, and certainly that they learned nothing from the recent election.
This is Mike Farnworth, MLA for Port Coquitlam, reminding you that in an age of alternative facts and fake news, tune into Voice of BC to get the real story of what's going on in British Columbia.
Every year, Santa receives over 1 million letters mailed to him by kids from Canada and around the world. And the amazing thing is, every letter he gets read, and everyone who writes him gets a letter back. How does he do it? No one's sure, but it's probably not all that hard for a guy who taught reindeer how to fly. Write to Santa Claus, North Pole, HOH, OHO, Canada. Include your return address, and he'll write back.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Email us at vobc@shaw.ca. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Or like us on Facebook at facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV.
Vaughn, Mike, Rob, and the rest of the press gallery make their living making predictions on what's going to happen in politics. But I'd like to see them put some skin in the game. Let's get some bets going, public bets, on what will happen with all the key issues. Put your money down. We can wager on Smitty, we can wager on Vaughn and their decision, and actually make it kind of a Lotto 649 of politics.
Well, you can see what kind of odds you got on the three of us for saying Site C is going to go ahead. You may be able to pay that one off fairly quickly. Let's go to Tillman, because his question is, once the Site C thing is out of the way, what's next for the government? Here's Bill.
Rob and Mike, I can't think of another government coming into office that has had so many challenges and so many yet to deal with. Not only is there Site C, there's LNG, there's Kinder Morgan, there's MSP premiums that they promised to eliminate. There's ICBC problems, enormous problems. Which do you think they're going to deal with next after Site C, and which do you think is the biggest one?
Well, the Premier said last week at his last big media scrum at the end of the session that the number one priority is housing, and I think because it was so central to the NDP's election platform, and I think central to the 10 seats they picked up in Metro Vancouver, I think that's what's next.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch the questions to the NDP in question period on housing. Where is the plan to build 114,000 new co-op rental units? Not a lot of answers on how that's going to happen, including in estimates. To go back to the election, I think there was some voters came away feeling like the NDP was going to do something on the housing file to reduce prices or to make it so that they can afford a home. And now you hear John Horgan saying, much like Christy Clark said, whoa, let's be careful. We don't want to do anything that's going to put people underwater on their mortgages, which is what bringing the price of housing down does. Maybe this is a supply issue. Maybe it's a very complex issue. Maybe there are a lot of factors. And the Greens are saying, look, Andrew Weaver told us this week, housing is one of the files the NDP have totally fallen down on. They criticized the Liberals so sharply on it. They claim to have a plan to get you into a house. And we have seen virtually nothing from them on that in the first few months in office. So that's a big one. I'd add childcare to it. We can discuss childcare if you want. But those are two that come to mind from the election for sure.
Well, we got a budget coming up in February, and we'll see if there's any big money in there for housing. I agree, that's certainly a big one. They've certainly talked a big game and promised a lot on housing. A lot of it requires cooperation with other levels of government. I mean, you've got the Justin Trudeau federal Liberal government has said, look, we want to get back into the housing game, so we're willing to come to the table. And then you've got to get some municipalities on side to sort of maybe loosen up zoning and some of the other NIMBYism that sometimes goes on that prevents densification of housing, and get them going too. So that's a real puzzle. Another one I would throw in there is one that Bill Thielman mentioned briefly there, and that's ICBC. ICBC is really in a tough financial shape. They're losing a lot of money. And one of the things the government has signaled that they may do to try and control the bleeding there is to bring in caps on the amount of payments that are made to people who are injured in auto accidents, who suffer what David Eby, the Attorney General, called minor injuries. So, for example, a soft tissue injury like whiplash. British Columbia in Canada is seen as kind of a wild west where people can, of ambulance chasing lawyers and people getting huge payouts for injuries suffered in car crashes. The government knows that's where a lot of this money is going, that's bleeding out of ICBC in these big losses. So they may move in and say, we're going to bring in restrictions on how much money people will be paid when they're injured. It's going to be controversial because lawyers will fight back against it and say, oh, this is bad. You're punishing people who have been, innocent people who have been injured in an accident. So there'll be a big fight over it. But it's been done in other provinces, and I think they're going to do it here.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, but I also agree with you, Mike, that it will be controversial, and not just because of the lawyers. Minor injuries are in the eye of the beholder. If you have whiplash, you may not think it's the least bit minor, you may think it's very debilitating.
That's right.
Here is something that we're waiting to see when this is going to happen. We've been off and on all fall wondering when it was going to happen. Andrew McLeod of the Tyee with a question about it. Here he is.
When former Premier Christy Clark resigned and stepped out of her seat in Kelowna West, it created the need for a by-election. The government has to call that within 6 months, and it looks like the government will wait as long as possible to do that. I'm wondering if, in your view, there's anything wrong with that. Is this just politics as normal, or should they be in more of a hurry to have somebody representing that constituency?
I know the Liberals drag their feet on these things, but still.
You know, it's fascinating how sometimes you get kind of deja vu in this job, because the same stories seem to repeat over and over again, and just the parties seem to change. Because, yeah, the Liberals did the same thing. They dragged their heels in calling it a by-election. If it's in a riding, they know they're going to lose. And that is certainly the case with this Kelowna riding that Christy Clark represented. That's a safe Liberal riding. So the NDP wants to keep it empty for as long as possible. And under the law,
they don't want a Liberal voting in the House as well.
That's right. That's right. It's so close. The standings are so close in the legislature. They don't want to give them another vote in there. So they will leave it empty for 6 months, which would probably put the by-election into February. Now you compare that to what's going on federally. And here's an example of how quickly this stuff can get done. When Diane Watts, the former Conservative MP in Surrey, announced that she was stepping down to run for the BC Liberal leadership, which she's doing right now. She made that announcement at the end of September. And next week, there's a by-election in Surrey to replace her. So that's just a little over 2 months, 2.5 months from the time she announced her resignation to you got a new MP. So it can be done. It doesn't have to take 6 months, and it is very hypocritical.
What do you think?
The problem, I think, and our press gallery colleague Les Lane from the Times Colonist outlined this after some aggressive questioning of the Premier on it, is that this is a particularly important time to be in the legislature, for your constituents to have a voice during debate on legislation to change the electoral system, to have a referendum on proportional representation. And there is no one speaking for the constituents of Kelowna West. And it gets a little awkward for the Premier to have to explain that when you put real stakes on it. Okay, it's an empty seat. We talk about the political games here and the seat count and the vote, but you know, there's no one speaking for them. We may look back on this year and say this is the year that the game changed in BC politics, that the NDP won, that the Greens propped them up, and that we started to move to change our electoral system, and nobody is representing that constituency. So Horgan did not have a very good answer when asked about it, other than cut me some slack was his...
He said he didn't have time, and Lane pointed out that all it takes for there to be a by-election is for the Premier to sign a piece of paper ordering one. That's it. He doesn't have... Elections BC handles everything else.
Yeah, I think
that was one of his weaker answers. I agree.
There's fatigue in both parties. You know, the Liberals benefit from Ben Stewart being their candidate, was the MLA before Christy Clark, has all the machinery and volunteers. But I think the NDP needed a bit of time to get up to speed to run there.
Go ahead.
Remember what the standings were in the House after the election. The NDP Green Alliance had what, a one-seat edge?
44-43.
Over the Liberals. So there was a lot of speculation about how long could this minority government survive? Could it fall very quickly? Could we be back into another election very soon? Well, the NDP got lucky when Darryl Plecas, a Liberal MLA, agreed to be the Speaker. That took one Liberal vote out of there. And when Christy Clark resigned, that gave them another little cushion. That's going to allow them to survive. Yeah. And so there's no way they want to call that by-election anytime soon.
You're right, and it's not just survival, but things that we've seen this fall. Ministers can travel, the Premier can go to conferences. I mean, remember, right at the very beginning, Horgan was doing sort of things like visiting the Kitimat smelter on a Saturday because the House wasn't sitting.
Right.
And the two cabinet ministers who went to the Peace River country to consult on Site C did it on a week when the House wasn't sitting. So, yeah, you're right. It isn't just it's partly managing the business of the House that it's very handy to have one fewer Liberal in there. Let's talk about what the Liberals are up to with a good question about it. Bruce Halser, here he is.
I'd be interested to know how you guys handicap the BC Liberal leadership race at this point, and who you think is going to ultimately be successful and why.
Been hard to follow it, I would say. I've gone to one of the debates myself and watched two others online, but the government has kept us really busy, and unlike the last BC Liberal leadership race in 2011, the winner of that one became Premier immediately, Christy Clark. But in this one, that may be 4 years away, or it might never happen.
Yeah, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone outside of the campaign teams that really is paying close attention to the Liberal leadership race at this point. But having watched the last debate, you do get a sense that, Diane Watts and Andrew Wilkinson had some of the most intense spars, I guess, we've seen so far, talking over each other, challenging each other. Wilkinson had an event where more caucus members appeared to endorse him from across the province. Depends on if you believe that caucus endorsements help a candidate win. You can see Christy Clark from the last Liberal leadership race to prove that's not necessarily the case. But you get a sense that Wilkinson and Stone are certainly some of the most organized. Wilkinson has a fully costed platform out. Stone has his own full platform.
And they're kind of leading the gang up on Watts.
They are, yeah. And Mike de Jong and Sam Sullivan are they appear to be not quite at that level right now.
What do you think?
Well, I think you've identified the three frontrunners there. I think Andrew Wilkinson, Todd Stone, two former Liberal cabinet ministers and current MLAs, versus the outsider, Diane Watts, the former mayor of Surrey and the former Conservative MP we mentioned earlier. And Diane Watts has taken a lot of criticism for her performance in these debates so far, that she's has not offered a very detailed plan at all. She's been asked some very specific questions about what she would do as Liberal leader, and has just kind of responded with some sort of vague talking points and that kind of thing. And she's never been a great speaker. I don't think she's really been terrific, obviously, and she's been underwhelming in these debates. But I still give her a heck of a shot to win, just because of the winning record that she has in Surrey. She's got some smart people working on her campaign. She's doing well in some of the outside opinion polls that have been commissioned, that people might look at her and say, a fresh start would be a good thing. So I wouldn't count her out by any means. A lot of people are saying like, oh, wow, she's really blown it with these lousy debate performances. I don't think she's out of it at all.
She's also collected a couple of nicknames, Waffle and Watts and No Plan Diane, which just tells you how this is pretty nasty. And within a political party, people are usually pretty careful about not attacking each other, because you have to unite the party afterward. If she wins, I think she's going to have a challenge.
Well, remember Christy Clark had one MLA in the Liberal caucus support her. Everyone thought, no, there's no way she can do it. She's an outsider. She shocked everyone. Diane Watts has got 0 MLAs supporting her. But you know what? I think some Liberals may look at her and say, all she does is win. All she does is win elections. As a Surrey councillor, and then as mayor for a long time, and then as an MP when there was a big Trudeau-mania wave swept through BC and the federal Liberals won a lot of seats, she hung on and kept the seats for the Conservatives. That's all she does is win elections. So I think some Liberals might look at that and like it.
And we don't know how many members they've all signed up. There's sign up for memberships continue right to the end of the year. And the Liberals have this unusual weighted system for voting. So if she's signed up a lot of people in some ridings, she may be a big chunk. Essentially they do 100 points per riding.
Right.
So if it's a riding with 1,000 members, you sign up 100 members, that's not that many. But if it's a riding with 100 members and you add 100, you've got a big jump. So the leadership isn't until February as well. The vote is February the 3rd. I think there'll be more attention on this race in the new year. Let's go and see what Jamie Lawson at UVic is asking about the other very unusual thing about this year in the legislature, namely the partnership that governs British Columbia. Here's Jamie.
Being close up to the major politicians in our legislature, I'm sure you've been able to see the wear and tear of legislative business on them. And it led me to ask you a question about the confidence and supply agreement, because the Greens have really taken on a whole lot of work that a caucus of 3 would not normally be expected to do. Given that they have to consult about a lot of different issues and also have to look at legislative initiatives, how are they holding up? Can they keep this pace going?
I was struck on her last day in the legislature that Sonia Firstenow, the new member from Cowichan, who was headed back over the Malahat to see her family, she's got a young family, said, I think all members will understand that what I'm mostly looking forward to is sitting on the sofa cuddling with my children. they do keep amazing hours.
I asked Andrew Weaver this question the other day, and he said, I am flat out exhausted. I am barely standing up at this point. He's up to 2 naps a day. Andrew Weaver has this couch in his office where he sleeps face down on the couch. He says he can nap anywhere and he can recharge his batteries in 15 minutes. So he sleeps down on this couch, and he's like, because he also blogs all of his decisions, all of what's happened that day. He says he's up till 12:30, 1 in the morning, blogging about why he did a certain thing. He's handling the Liberal amendments that come through and fighting with the Liberals on amending NDP bills, and he's drafting his own amendments. He's meeting with the Premier. They have these confidence in supply agreement meetings. I mean, it is a lot of work for the Greens. They're asking for more money, which is a whole other issue as part of their new party status. They want a budget boost, which would give them more staff and maybe some more resources. Whether they get that, we won't know probably until next year. But they're going flat out in the Green caucus, and they're doing a lot. They are up on almost every file. They're speaking. They pop into estimates. They amend bills. They're all over the place.
Take shots at the government.
Yeah, maybe that's why he's so tired. He criticizes the NDP so much. I think Andrew Weaver's gone after the NDP on
rideshare.
What? Let's run it down. The Uber ride-sharing stuff, minimum wage, grizzly bear hunting, Site C Dam,
hydro freeze,
fundraising. I mean, just it seems like almost every day he's up on his feet criticizing Horgan's government, which I sometimes wonder if the NDP look at him and think, well, with friends like you, do we really need any
or are these pillow fights?
Well, they are pillow fights. I mean, I think that for Weaver, he wants to be seen as, he doesn't want to be seen as John Horgan's lapdog or anything, something like that. He wants himself and the Green Party to remain seen as an independent party. But, despite all the criticism of the government, there's no way that they will bring the government down. Remember that Andrew Weaver holds the balance of power. They could turn around and vote the government down and force an election at any time that the House is in session. They won't do that, and I believe the reason they won't is that the big prize for them is proportional representation. This is the voting system that they want. They need to keep the NDP government in power to get it, and so there's nothing they will do. There's nothing the NDP can do to make Andrew Weaver turn on them.
I agree with you, Mike, but at a media scrum in his office this week, Weaver absolutely insisted that PR has nothing to do with it. That's not, that's not why we got into politics. It's the closest I've come to ever saying BS on Weaver, but because that's clearly what they want more than anything.
The only reason
that's not what they're there for.
The only reason they hold the balance of power now is from a once-in-a-lifetime fluke election result, the closest election result in BC history. That probably will not happen again. If they are going to continue to maintain this influence and hold the balance of power, they need pro-rep. They need a proportional representation voting system, and they've got to make sure they get it.
And in the same media event, he also said there's no likelihood the Greens would win a majority government in the next election.
That's right.
Which is the other half of that equation. If you're not going to win, you're going to need to have some balance of power, some outcome that gives you influence, and that's what they have right now.
Canadian Taxpayers Federation question about another big thing. Mike's already mentioned this is a big thing coming next year, but let's go to the exact question. Chris Sims.
Hi, gentlemen. We wanted your predictions for the coming fiscal year. Looking ahead to the BC budget, what's your prediction? Are we going to see balanced budgets and low taxes? Or are we going to see more spending and higher costs?
Well, we got a financial update last week, and the finances are tightening up.
Yeah. I mean, what the razor's edge, or as Mike de Jong used to call it, when the surplus gets down to the $200 million on a $50 billion budget, it's not a lot of breathing room. You look at the NDP's election platform and the fiscal costing for promises like the renter's rebate, which would blow the surplus out of the water right now if they were to do it, the $400 renter's rebate, or the first year of $10 a day childcare. Those alone would tilt the government out of bed. So I think for the budget, and Vaughn, you predicted this the day of the budget, we're going to see tax increases in the February budget, some type of revenue-generating tax measures, and because they need the money to fund the things that they want to do and that they've promised to do.
Come back to you after the break, Mike, but we're going to take a break first on Voice of BC. Stay with us.
I think it's fair to say that there hasn't been a whole lot of news coming out of question period so far. I think this is in part because the opposition is figuring out how to be opposition. They are getting started on the research it will take to bring good questions forward. I also think that the leadership race will make a difference. Once they have a leader in place, which should be around the start of February, I think it will give the party more of an idea of their direction forward and really who they are.
I'm Zach Hyman with the Toronto Maple Leafs. The penalties I face on the ice are nothing like the ones that drivers receive if they are caught driving impaired by alcohol or drugs. License suspensions and vehicle impoundment, fines, fees, insurance increases, a criminal record, and much more. Avoid these penalties by having a designated driver, taking a cab, calling home, or staying the night. Join my team to help shut out impaired driving.
Visit ArriveAlive.org to find out more. Arrive Alive. Drive sober.
Twas the week before Christmas, and all through BC, people were waiting upon the fate of Site C. The building trades waited to see if their members would still have their jobs come the end of December. The Premier had looked to the BC UC for a solution, but lo, their report did not come to a conclusion. Andrew Weaver pulled one way, Tom Sigurdsson the other, and the cabinet itself seemed all in a flutter. Oh, how will it end? What will be the fate of Site C? You'll find out the details after Christmas on Voice of BC.
We're hung by the chimney with care. Let's come straight back to Mike, because we were talking before we went away about the budget, and we already know Budget Day. It's written into law, and it's the third Tuesday of February. So not long after the Liberals pick that new leader, we get a throne speech and a budget. What are you expecting?
Well, I remember earlier we were talking about how sometimes you get deja vu in this BC politics. It seems like things seem to repeat. Just the names change, the parties flip around. One of the things I recall happening in the past is sometimes you get a new government takes over, and one of the things you can always count on is that they'll take a look at the books and they'll say, oh my goodness, things are worse than we thought. The previous government didn't tell us the truth.
Yeah.
Now we can't keep our promises. That's happened many times in BC.
Yeah.
I was kind of detecting that a little bit with this new budget approaching. And I thought, remember that the NDP promised to balance the budget, keep the budget balanced. One thing I've been looking for, is there any hint or signal that they're going to go into a deficit in February? Now, I thought maybe with ICBC being in such terrible shape, I was listening carefully to some of the things that David Eby has said about that, saying, boy, this is way worse than we thought. ICBC is just bleeding money. Could they use that as an excuse to say, we're going back into a deficit and it's the Liberals' fault because they weren't straight with this about ICBC? But interestingly, Carol James, the finance minister, indicated pretty clearly the other day that she expected to table a balanced budget in February.
But she did cut herself, this is a good point you're making, she did cut herself slack on a couple of things. She said, when she was asked about the child care plan, well, that's a 10-year plan, right? The 114,000 units of housing, well, that's a 10-year plan. And the Premier was interesting on the child care. He said, we need a willing partner in a federal government to do everything we want on child care. So the feds are promising money, but they're slow coming forward with it. And they've been slow to come forward on transit. They're not doing housing at the pace the New Democrats want. And I wonder if they aren't creating some maneuvering room for them on things like that.
Oh, man. Their heads are going to explode if the NDP back away from $10 a day childcare. They're going to have trouble just renaming it, which is what the Greens want. They don't want $10 a day childcare.
They say that's a gimmick, right?
They say it's a gimmick. They want a different plan, and they're arguing over the name, and that's getting people upset. So walking away from childcare, delaying it, blaming the feds is, holy moly, that will not be good for them.
Let's go to the other big political event of 2018 in the fall, and we've already had a pretty good discussion about this because the legislation just went through the legislature, and that is the coming referendum. Here with a question about it, Bill Tillman.
Mike and Rob, one of the concerns that I have about proportional representation electoral system is that we can see in Europe, far-right parties have gained a foothold in a number of legislatures through getting a minimal amount of votes and not winning a single geographic seat. These parties are not simply right-wing, they are extreme. Do you think that if we had a proportional representation system in British Columbia with a threshold of votes of 5% or less, we would see similar type parties, far-right parties, here in our legislature?
You hear some New Democrats say that they think the Liberal Party would split if we got proportional representation into Conservatives and Liberals, and some of them think that's a good thing. But Tillman raised an interesting issue, which is the Liberal Party tends to be pretty conservative on economic issues, but it's not especially religious right conservative on social issues. Pro-choice on abortion, not anti-immigration, no problem with a lot of gay rights issues and human rights issues. So Tillman's raising an interesting issue there, which is, would you get an old Bill Vander Zalm style social conservative party in BC like the old Reform Party? I wonder if he's right.
Well, those members are there, right? I mean, we see them, the Liberal members who have social conservative views, and every now and again it pops up some sort of climate change questioning or transgendered rights. There's quite often speeches in the House from certain members that aren't quite fully supportive of that. And they're kept in check, if depending on your political view, by a centrist liberal party that contains those liberals and conservatives. And if we went this route, there is an argument that could be made that maybe the right part of that party fractures off. And then the question is, well, who does that benefit? And you could make an argument actually that it doesn't really benefit the NDP, because what would happen is the Liberals, if they still call themselves that, could get quite a few votes and have to appeal to their former umbrella colleagues that are now a new right party and actually have to perhaps even grant them concessions to get their support. And you might see the Liberal Party as we know it tilt to the right a little bit because the right wing has more voice to influence the party's outcome. And I don't know how, I mean, it changes our system. It changes the dialogue we have. We don't talk about abortion rights right now. We don't talk about rights for gay and lesbian people. We've just, I think as a society, some of us think that's been settled. But there are members who would like to have that conversation, and they could have their own party.
You've written a couple of columns, Mike, about the government, the way you've put it, stacking the deck to get the result they want in this referendum next year.
Well, proportional representation, this is a complex issue, but I think people should begin to read about it and understand it, because it is a fundamental overhaul of our democracy, and this is going to be a big issue. It's going to be a big issue going forward in 2018. The way the system operates is it benefits the smaller parties. So the reason that Andrew Weaver and the Green Party want it so badly is because they would benefit the most from it. Like if you look at the results in the last election, I think the Green Party got 17%
that's about right.
of the popular vote, around there. And they got 3 seats, which is about 3.5% of the seats in the BC legislature. So they got 17% of the vote, 3% of the seats. And they say, this is not fair. If we went on a pure proportional representation system where the seats were distributed according to the percentage of the votes you achieve, well, they should get 17% of the seats in the House, which would be like 15 seats. They could quintuple their seats. And that's why they want it, because it would give them that much more clout. And potentially, if voting patterns continue the way they are right now, puts them in a perpetual, almost balance of power situation. So Andrew Weaver and the Green Party become extremely important. The NDP right now are in a governing alliance with the Green Party, and they both say they support this pro-rep system. They're both going to campaign for it. The Liberals, who conceivably could be frozen out of power under a scenario like that, are dead set against it. They're scared to death of it, and they're going to fight it tooth and nail. The NDP and the Greens, I agree with you, it seems to me they are stacking the deck for the thing to pass. They want this to pass. So they are setting the bar as low as it can possibly go for the referendum to succeed. It requires only a 50% plus one province-wide majority for the referendum to pass. You compare that to 2 earlier referenda we had on the same issue, it was 60% was required, and the government said, this is such a profound change to our system, we want to make sure we got a clear mandate from the people. So we'll set it at 60% plus a supermajority of regional riding. So it'd be majority outcome in 60% of all the ridings. That's not there either. It's just as simple, 50% plus one. That's as low as you can possibly set the bar for this thing to pass. They really want it to pass.
And they got asked in the legislature last week about turnout, because somebody asked the Attorney General's minister, what if there's only 10% turnout? It's a mail ballot. Well, there may not be that much interest in it. I think that's too low, but, what if? And they said, no, it doesn't matter what the turnout is. The third of British Columbians send in these ballots. That's enough to carry the day. Again, they don't want to get engaged in discussion of that. They've also produced a questionnaire, which I think is kind of loaded as well. So, that may backfire. It's early, but next year when we get the report and the question or questions and all that, people might see it differently. We have a forestry question here from Ken Wu, who we haven't seen on the show for a while. Here's Ken.
So a concern for environmentalists working on forestry in this province is that the NDP's largest donor, biggest supporter, was the Steelworkers Union. The Steelworkers are the union most heavily involved in old-growth logging and raw log exports. At the same time, there are several other forestry unions that are working with the conservation groups to protect old-growth forests and to end raw log exports and to support sustainable, value-added second-growth forestry. Given that there's a fracture within the forestry labor movement, I'm wondering if you have any insights on which way this may end up playing out in terms of forest policy in BC.
Well, I think all bets are off on what the New Democrats are going to do on forestry, because the forest fires this summer burned the equivalent of the entire annual allowable cut for British Columbia for a year. And I think the New Democrats are going to have to think seriously about how to keep that industry going on the coast and in the interior, and they may have to put off some of their environmental goals.
Yeah, there's a suggestion that they should help harvest the damaged timber very quickly before it rots, provide incentives for that to be used in the mills, keep people employed, keep the mills working on that timber. NDP haven't quite settled on that plan either. I mean, to go to the question, the steelworkers were possibly the most influential union in the election. I mean, they gave the money that allowed the NDP to have the staff, the campaign director, Bob Dewar, the senior staff. They donated just an avalanche of money to the NDP. They hold a significant sway on New Democrats. And, the split between in the labor movement within forestry is similar to the split within the NDP itself. There's a very powerful environmental caucus. There's the natural resource side of the party as well. So I don't discount the voice of the steelworkers. Earlier we talked about liquor and the BC GEU, and I think between the steelworkers and the GEU, you have almost all of and the BC Fed, almost all of the money tied up in who donates to the NDP right there.
I think one of the big dangers to this government is if the economy starts to go south. Right now we got a pretty robust economy, pretty good employment rates, like record high employment. But if things take a turn and we start going into some bad economic news, one of the big dangers for the NDP is if the public perceives that the NDP are responsible for it by bringing in policies that are unfriendly to business, or they bring in regulations on forestry or any other natural resource sectors that are at least perceived by the public as you're responsible for the bad economic times or people losing their jobs. So I think this is it's a dangerous area for the NDP, and it'll be interesting to see how aggressive they get on things like raw log exports. But I think overall, the other big one in forestry is the dispute over the softwood lumber agreement with the United States, and that's a much bigger file that I think is going to receive a lot higher priority from the government.
I'm going to go to a question on the by-election. Here's Bruce Halser.
There's a by-election on December 11th in the federal Surrey riding that Diane Watts vacated. Who do you think is going to win, and what do you think the implications are of the Liberals stealing that riding or the Conservatives maintaining it?
Mike.
It's close. That's a close by-election. This is the seat that was vacated by Diane Watts when she decided to run for the Liberal leadership. This is normally a Conservative seat or a right-of-centre seat that historically has always voted for the Conservatives or the Canadian Alliance or the Reform Party or whatever over the years. I don't think the Liberals have ever won it, but it was close last time. Diane Watts won by a narrow margin, and it's a dogfight right now between the Conservatives and the federal Liberals, and that's reflected in the fact that you see the two-party leaders out there campaigning Justin Trudeau's been out there twice, going through the riding, doing coffee shop events and kissing babies.
He still has that crowd drawing ability in BC.
I thought they were there to see Gordie Hogue. 1,000 people lined out at a coffee shop to see Gordie Hogue.
The federal Liberal candidate is a former provincial Liberal.
Yes, the Conservative, the Liberal candidate.
Liberal candidate.
Yeah. Gordie Hogue, who is a longtime former Liberal MLA. He was also the mayor of White Rock. Great candidate for them because he's got great name recognition. He's a popular kind of guy in the region. The Conservatives are running a former Conservative MP as their candidate. Andrew Scheer, who is the new federal leader of the Conservatives, he has also been through the riding twice. But you're right. I mean, there's kind of like a deficit charisma there for sure. Because I think if the two of them walk down the downtown White Rock, I think Andrew Scheer would probably be able to walk through the riding without anyone even recognizing him. But if Trudeau walked through, it'd be like he'd be mobbed for selfies. So I think the Liberals have high hopes of knocking the Conservatives off in this riding and stealing one from them, and they just might.
It doesn't very often happen that an incumbent government wins by-elections, right? Except in the seats they already held. The steal a seat's a big deal.
That's Trudeau mania for you, isn't it? It's Gordie Hogue is a very good candidate, but he's getting the Trudeau bump for sure. He'd do okay without it, but those people are there to see Trudeau, not him.
The federal Liberals are still polling very well in British Columbia. If you take a look at national federal opinion polling over the last month or so, the Liberals have gone down in a lot of areas of Canada, except in Quebec and right here in British Columbia, where they're still doing extremely well. So whatever that Trudeau magic is out here, it seems to be working for them, and they just might steal that seat from the Conservatives, and it's a really tough fight. It's very close.
Legalized pot. Isn't that interesting what you're saying, though, Mike? Because think about the this enormous backlash over the approval of the twinning of the Kinder Morgan pipeline through BC, which supposedly is this vote-killing idea out here, and yet it doesn't seem, maybe because they're not actually building it, it hasn't actually blown up as a bad issue for them yet.
No, and there are some other issues, though. And I've interviewed both candidates there in the by-election, and the Conservative candidate told me that when they feel their campaign's going well, that people are upset about taxes. Bill Morneau, the federal finance minister, has had a very rough ride here over the last month with things like threatened taxes on small business. He's had some difficulty explaining how his own personal family fortune has been handled as a finance minister. And this is a riding where the talk of taxes and people having a tough time making ends meet right now isn't negative for the Liberals. And there's some other issues festering out there as well. So the federal Liberals seem to be doing okay in the opinion polls. But it's a close one, and that's traditionally a Conservative seat.
The other thing that jumped out at me from what Mike was just saying, Rob, and I'll let you wrap up on this, is there is a new leader of the federal NDP, but I don't think he's a factor out here yet.
Well, he was very popular at the BC NDP convention, came out and spoke, but no, he hasn't been on the hustings out here for the by-election yet. It seems to be down to the two.
That's not an NDP seat.
No, they got 10% of the vote.
It'd be amazing if the Liberals win it, so the NDP aren't really a factor there.
Yeah. And it'd be interesting if the Conservatives lose that seat, which Watts gave up, and she continues to struggle uphill in the federal Liberal seat. She might be out of both jobs, I suppose, by February.
Could be.
Yeah. Do you, have the Greens got a candidate out there?
I believe they're running a candidate, but it's a no-hoper. It's a neck and neck.
The Greens
fight.
Andrew Weaver's talking up the Green candidate in the West Kelowna by-election, though, and he thinks, by the way, that vote will be late January. He thinks Horgan will call it in the new year.
Yeah, well, the NDP candidate in West Kelowna is the former candidate from the last election. Ben Stewart is the Liberal candidate, well-known, former cabinet minister, great owner of a great winery, Quail's Gate, very good wines. So that'll be a by-election to watch for sure.
With that, we will end and thank the two guests very much. Thank you, Mr. Smyth.
My pleasure, anytime.
Good to have you. And thank you, Mr. Shaw. Good to have you
Thanks,
here.
fun.
Thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics into your living room. And we now move to encore presentations through to the new year. Have a good holiday season and good night.